Welcome to Acquiring Aquinas, Summa Theologiae, Part 1, Question 1, Article 9, looking at the question whether Holy Scripture should use metaphors. What we do here in these videos is try to break down the structure and thought of Aquinas' treatment of each particular article to really help us to get at the essence of the claims being made by Aquinas and the fundamental reasons that he's making these claims. This will help us to take a step back to look at how these beliefs of Aquinas fit together in a kind of systematic way. Now we're looking at question 1 here, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine, really looking at the nature of sacred doctrine in a broader context, how it's differentiated and related to other sciences. The conclusion that Aquinas makes in this article is that Holy Scripture is that which ought to use metaphors. Now, of course, we are all familiar with metaphors used in Scripture. For example, in the dealing with the Israelites, sometimes it is said that God has repented and has changed his mind or regretted, for example, entering into a guiding relationship to the Israelites. And of course, this metaphorical language is understood to not be literally true. A metaphor is that which is said of something that is not literally true when we predicate it of it. So when we say that he was a fox, not literally a fox, but someone that is being crafty like a fox. Similarly with these metaphors said of God, also not literally true. So the question here is whether it's appropriate that Holy Scripture uses these metaphors. Now this question might strike one as a little bit weird. I mean, Holy Scripture is that which is what it is, and it is understood to be divinely inspired. So how does it make sense to say that the Holy Scripture ought not to use metaphors when it is clear that it does use metaphors? Perhaps a way of thinking about this is by way of thinking of this question in terms of what's the best way to approach an interpretation of the Scriptures. Should we de-emphasize these metaphors or sort of ignore these metaphors, or should they be appropriately understood as being beneficial way of thinking about God? All right, so the first objection argument to the conclusion that Holy Scripture is that they shouldn't use metaphors. Major premise: no science that holds the highest place among sciences is that which ought to use metaphors. Minor premise: Holy Scripture is a science that holds the highest place among sciences. Conclusion: thus, sacred Scripture is not that which ought to use metaphors, and this contradicts the answer. Now, support for the major premise is given as follows. Aquinas points out a distinctive feature of poetry, which is the lowest among the sciences according to Aristotle, which is that it utilizes similitudes and figures, or in other words, metaphor. You think of imagery, emotive, the kind of emotive nature of poetry, that it is distinctive of a low science and so inappropriate for a high science, let alone the highest science. So the question is not whether it is appropriate to use it in any science at all, but whether it's appropriate to use it in the highest science. The minor premise: Holy Scripture is a science that holds the highest place among sciences. This premise, of course, was supported for in earlier articles in this question, when it was argued that sacred doctrine is the noblest and the truest wisdom among all the other sciences because of the source as being God's knowledge of himself given to us through faith. Thus, Holy Scripture is not that which ought to use metaphors. Second objection argument against the claim that Holy Scripture is that which ought to use metaphors. Major premise: no doctrine which seeks to make truth clear is that which ought to use metaphor. Minor premise: Holy Scripture is that doctrine which seeks to make truth clear. Conclusion: thus Holy Scripture is not that which ought to use metaphors, and this contradicts the answer. Supporting the major premise for this objection, it is pointed out regarding this major premise that metaphor doesn't make truth clearer, but in fact more obscure. The problem with metaphor is that it's ambiguous, and so not literally or precisely true of that which is described through it. Ambiguity is a feature of language in the case in which it's not clear the specific meaning that a term expresses. So in other words, it's a term that expresses more than one different meaning, and one can't clearly identify what distinct meaning is being expressed. So when describing a thing metaphorically, there are aspects that are true of the thing and aspects that are not true of the thing. When a river is said to be like a snake, It is both like and unlike a snake. Second, metaphor isn't literally true of things that it describes. And so instead of presenting the thing itself, it presents something through something else, thereby obscuring truth regarding the nature of the thing itself. Now, in terms of the minor premise, Holy Scripture is that doctrine which seeks to make truth clear. In Sirach, it makes the claim that making truth clear about God is laudatory, in which it says, quote, "They that explain me shall have life everlasting." And so it would seem to be appropriate that clear language should be sought in Holy Scriptures. Therefore, metaphor does not befit the science of sacred doctrine. There is a third objection argument. Major premise, no attempt to represent God through higher creatures is that which ought to use metaphors. Minor premise, Holy Scripture is an attempt to represent God through higher creatures. Conclusion, thus Holy Scripture is not that which ought to use metaphors, and this contradicts the answer. Now, this is a very interesting argument. It shows that Aquinas seeks to present a steel man, not a straw man, version of his opponent's arguments. There's something rather nuanced about this particular argument. Now, in support of the major premise that no attempt to represent God through higher creatures is that which ought to use metaphors. Metaphorical language is a representation of things through things that are able to be perceived or have an image attached, as well as that which elicits a relatable emotional response. For example, when God is represented as a rock or a lion, it is argued in this premise that this is a representation of God further away from the representation of God through higher creatures, such as through angels or more supremely intelligent principles, such as truth, being, or beauty. It is these latter ideas that should be taken chiefly to represent God. And precisely it's their non-metaphorical status which is operative here. Now, in terms of the minor premise, Holy Scripture is an attempt to represent God through higher creatures. It is assumed or admitted here that God must be understood and represented through creatures. But the question is about what is more suitable way to represent God. It is argued further, though, that God is represented in Holy Scripture through higher creatures and not lower creatures. This is because if an interpretation of Scripture will be more adequate when higher creatures are used to represent God than lower creatures. So in other words, it's the job of Holy Scripture to present most accurately and most clearly God, and so therefore Holy Scripture will be an attempt to represent God through the higher creatures, the more intelligible creatures, than through the lower creatures, assuming that God must be represented through creatures at all. So it's concluded that Holy Scripture is not that which ought to use metaphors. Moving on to the on the contrary argument. Major premise. That which uses visions and similitudes is that which ought to use metaphors. Minor premise. Holy Scripture is that which uses visions and similitudes. Conclusion, thus Holy Scripture is that which ought to use metaphors. In terms of the major premise here, it's really a question of the meaning of the terms themselves. In fact, there's a direct tie between the meaning of what similitude is and what metaphor is. In fact, the definition of metaphor includes the notion of similitude. It is in virtue of some similarity between the image and the things represented by it that the meaning of a metaphor is able to function. In terms of the minor premise, that Holy Scripture is that which uses visions and similitudes, a passage from Hosea is used to support this premise, where it says that, quote, "I have multiplied visions and I have used similitudes by the ministry of the prophets," end quote. This is very interesting since visions are something recognized as relating to a special communication with God, and yet it is drawn from the same word as sight or vision. And so the conclusion follows that Holy Scripture is that which ought to use metaphors. And we can see here that Aquinas gives two arguments for the conclusion, sort of two of his own arguments. The first is, major premise, all teachings of intellectual truths through sensible objects is that which ought to use metaphors. Minor premise, Holy Scripture is the teaching of intellectual truths through sensible objects. And then conclusion, thus Holy Scripture is that which ought to use metaphors. Support for the major premise is given through what we can see as another syllogism that has the major premise as its conclusion. So here we go. The first premise is all matters appropriate to the capacity of the nature of human knowing are that which ought to use metaphors. And this is true because, as Aquinas says, all our knowledge originates from sense, and metaphors are related to sensible similitudes. So, all matters appropriate to the capacity of the nature of human knowing are that which ought to use metaphors. The next premise: all teachings of intellectual truths through sensible objects are matters appropriate to the capacity of the nature of human knowing. And so, therefore, all teachings of intellectual truths through sensible objects is that which ought to use metaphors. So here there's a strong connection between our natural capacity to know, the source of our knowledge through sensation, and the appropriateness of metaphors, which involve things like sensible similitudes. So since all knowledge comes through the senses, metaphors will be an appropriate modality of that knowledge. In terms of the minor premise that Holy Scripture is the teaching of intellectual truths through sensual objects, we see that Holy Scripture appropriately uses particular historical figures, images, and other kinds of lessons, parables, stories in the teaching of the intellectual truths and the attaining of this special kinds of knowledge as it's related to sense, as a kind of general appropriate way for human knowledge to operate. So therefore it is appropriate for Holy Scripture to utilize metaphor. And Aquinas gives us here a bonus argument. Major premise: that which instructs without distinction of persons is that which ought to use metaphors. Minor premise: Holy Scripture is that which instructs without distinction of persons. Conclusion: Holy Scripture is that which ought to use metaphors. In terms of the major premise, it might be thought as a kind of strange phrase, the idea of instructing without distinction of persons, but it's a pretty well comprehended idea. Specifically, instruction of those, regardless of their level of knowledge, of intelligence, is meant here. So although those more sophisticated intellectuals may not value the overuse of metaphor in explaining things, they should be used when you are speaking to those who are not as sophisticated and those who are more unlearned. It is not that metaphors are doing harm to the more cerebral types, but they are being more helpful for those to access the message of the scriptural teachings in a more practical way to the more simple-minded, for example, for children. Now, in terms of the minor premise, Holy Scripture is that which instructs without distinction of persons, we see that Holy Scripture's audience is all men and all women, and not just the learned. That this is the case, one can look back to earlier in the question where Aquinas argues that all have God as their end and source of salvation, and Scripture is to communicate to all regarding this and to call them to discipleship. So therefore, Holy Scripture is that which ought to use metaphors. Now we can get at that first objection argument, which has as its major premise that no science that holds the highest place among sciences is that which ought to use metaphors. Aquinas thinks that this premise is weak. He instead argues that some science that holds the highest place among sciences is that which ought to use metaphors, and this contradicts this major premise. Now the reason why Aquinas denies the truth of this major premise is as follows. Aquinas points out that it is not the mere use of metaphors that is distinctive of poetry, which is the lowest of sciences. Rather, what is distinctive about poetry is the way that it uses metaphors, specifically to produce a representation in a human being which pleases them. In sacred doctrine, metaphors are used as both necessary and useful. Necessary because all knowledge comes through the senses, as we've said, and useful such that all human beings, regardless of their level of understanding and learning, may benefit from it. Now, in terms of the second objection argument, there is the major premise that claims that no doctrine that seeks to make truth clear is that which ought to use metaphor. Aquinas rejects this for the idea that some doctrine which seeks to make truth clear is that which ought to use metaphor. Now, it is granted by Aquinas that in a sense, divine revelation is veiled by sensible imagery. This is the language, for example, used by Pseudo-Dionysius. And so in this way, metaphor may obscure a kind of clarity of truth. However, this is not all of the story, since truth remains in such a communication that the minds of those to whom revelation has been made do not rest in those metaphors, but is prompted by them and raises them to the knowledge of truths that they can achieve and then relate it to others. That the mind does not rest in metaphor, but ascends to knowledge of the truth beyond it, is shown in the fact that one and the same thing is taught in one place in Scripture metaphorically and in others non-metaphorically. Speaking in metaphor helps both stimulate the exercise of thoughtful minds as well as to defend it against ridicule of the impious. Sort of this idea of Christ saying not to cast the pearls before the swine. The third objection argument, the minor premise, Holy Scripture is an attempt to represent God through higher creatures, is rejected in favor of the idea that Holy Scripture is not an attempt to represent God through higher creatures. In fact, Aquinas thinks that it is more fitting that divine truth should be expounded under the figure of less noble rather than more noble bodies or creatures. And there are three reasons he gives for this. The first, this is actually better at preserving the human mind from error regarding divine matters. Since it is clear that metaphorical descriptions are not literal descriptions of divine truths, and so prevents one from doubting such truth. So we know that they're metaphorical descriptions. Although expressing divine truths through more noble creatures might be literally true, since they are harder to understand, there leaves room the possibility of someone misunderstanding this. Because, for example, they're unable to accurately think in terms of the more noble creatures, and desiring to definitely deny this literal truth of God. So it opens up to errors. Second, this type of communication of truths is more fitting regarding the kind of knowledge appropriate of God that we have in this life, where to think of what God is not is more clear than thinking about what God is. Metaphors are taken from things far from God, and so it leaves us with a truer understanding that God is above whatever we may say or think of him. And then finally, this mode of communication of divine truths allows such truths to remain hidden from the unworthy, as Jesus says we are to do.